Hi, Misha here, and quite recently did a video looking at Romanian 545x39 guns, often called AK-74s, but really derived from their PA-86 export name AIMS-74. Really, I talked about the early guns, the Kuger, the WUM-2, the Mark II, the Romak-II, and the Romak-991, as well as my SAR-2 and eventually the WASR-2, really because I had examples to get rid with and show you about. Doing that, and after, people asked for me to kind of cover the early imports and whatnot of 7.62x39 guns. And this week alone, I've had quite a few questions come through on older videos about the WASR-10 63 and dating them and what have you. Long story short, it felt like a good time to revisit 7.62x39 Romanian guns. So I have my 5 out here again. And also, I wanted to talk with you a bit. This is going to be the last video of kind of, I guess you'd say, the old era of the channel. Moving forward, we're going to have more and more changes, hopefully for the positive, for the better, and trying new things, expanding new things. You know, needs must, change or die. So throughout the video, I'll kind of talk about that. And also, to be honest, since Jay stepped away at the end of March 2021, I've been doing this essentially on my own for 4 months, and I am tired. So there will be a brief vacation coming up soon. But first, after this video, the next one will be something quite special, unique, and hopefully fun for all of you. So please stay tuned for that. That'll be coming out after this one. But with that said, yeah, let's talk about Romanian imports and the guns that inspired them. Of course, over here I have my SAR-1. This is essentially a semi-automatic PM63. Over here we have a WASR-10 63 UF, a semi-automatic PM65. Up top we have the AS-10B, a semi-automatic PM64. I nearly didn't bring this one out because it's been out quite recently for the AES-10 video. If you wonder the difference between 10 and 10B, I covered that in some detail a month ago. So those are kind of the original 60s era guns. Here we have the modern WASR-10, not 1063, and it's set up as a PM90 rifle. It's a modern version. And then finally, we have my WASR-10 63 KR set up as a PM90 short rifle, but with an extended muzzle brake from the factory on it. So a pretty good roundup of what Romania has used over the years, with only a couple of omissions. And these do range, at least the last 20 years of importation, from the SAR to the WASR-10, 1063, and now back to the WASR-10. And we will touch upon guns like the RH-10 and M10. Why not? We like talking about AKs, especially Romanian. So with that, we'll dive in. But first, if you please could like, share, and subscribe. Also, love to hear from you, so feel free to comment. And if you'd like to help support the channel as we continue to try to grow, check out the link to our Patreon page. And enough with the intro. Let's talk about AKs. AES-10B, first mag. Good. For me, and a lot of us, our first Romanian AK was an SAR-1 like this, or a WASR-10. but those were not the first ones in the country. Now, there were no pre-ban Romanian guns. It wasn't until mid-1997 that the first ones came in. And for the 545 history, like the Kerr 2 and the Mark II, you can refer to our recent video from back in May. But for the 7.6239, the first one to come in was the WUM-1, WUM-1. That was brought over by Intrac. And really around exactly the same time, DIG, Dominion Investment Group, imported the Romak-1. And these are a little bit different. And the WUM is interesting because there's a lot of stories about it having originally been configured for the European market, potentially Germany, and they seem to be true because the earlier WUM-1s really went above and beyond. Yeah, they had the 16-inch barrel, they had a double stack magwell with dimples, but they could have half moon cuts in the back to prevent stock and grip from being installed, so they can only have the PSL style stock. A lot of them also had the PSL style scope rail mounted higher, and some would have threaded barrels, some wouldn't, but either way they would have kind of a cap tack welded on. And externally they had some weird things going on with the sights. Some early WUM-1s had a 300 meter, so like a sporter rear sight, and even stranger, some had a reversed front sight base. Instead of kind of the vertical being here and the here, it was flipped around, so they installed it backwards intentionally. Furthermore, some had a system wherein the fire control group and the safety could not easily be removed, and some even had a small pin tack welded to the rear trunnion that interrupted the bolt carrier in such a way that a military full auto carrier with the trip in the back could not be used. So yeah, the WUM-1s were kind of all over the place, and quality seems to be the same, and there are reports of mismatched serial numbers, hard to verify. Yeah. Now, the Romak-1 was a little more consistent. It was a lot more like this gun. They came in with thumbhole stocks, but they had square back receivers. They originally would have the palm swell handguards. They had double stack magwells. And a lot of times they would have threaded barrels, but with a cap spot welded on. Of course, they would have the bayonet lug removed because this was after the 1989 ban, but it was before the magwell changes that were implemented in April of 1998. And that's kind of where our story can pick up here with this gun. WASR-10. In 99, Intrac seems to kind of fall away from the Romanian guns, and DIG imported the Romak-991. In my 545 video, I did show a Romak-992. In the difference, it had a single stack magwell, much like a WASR. And the Romak-991 and 992 had slab side receivers with plates spot welded in instead of dimples, and they came in as single stackers, what have you. 99 was also the year Century Arms joins the Romanian game, kind of taking over from Intrac, and they took a different tactic. They imported this gun, the SAR-1, the semi-automatic rifle 1, and it still has a double stack magwell. They got around this by kind of playing with the definition of a rifle and bringing over as a barreled system, a barrel action, converting them with 922R parts, so on and so forth. Now, they did not have bayonet lugs, and originally the SAR-1s did not have threaded barrels, but mine's threaded for the simple fact that there was plenty of meat to thread it 14x1 left hand. And when Century would sell these, they would have a military stock and grip and handguard with the palm swells on them. Of course, I've replaced the furniture on mine with PM63, well, G furniture. And these had the standard AK rail. So, yeah, Romak-991 essentially was the WASR imported during the ban by any other name, and usually just sold as a thumbhole stalker with a single stack magwell, although some companies did convert them and sell them as converted. As for the SAR-1, they were sold with either a 5 or 10 round shorty mag, even though it was double stack, and sometimes they would also be sold with a quote-unquote surplus pre-94 certified 30 round mag as well. WASR-10. And here are the magwells. The SAR-1 with the factory double stack well, the WASR-10 with the cut open magwell. Notice the smaller dimple versus the larger one here. That's a good telltale, aside from the fact that of course they don't have the dimples. But yeah, they were doing the single stack thing as early as 1999, but DIG would quickly fall away, leaving Century nearly the exclusive importer of Romanian guns for the next 20 years. But at this point, we've only really had one style. 16-inch barrel, fixed buttstock, patterned after the PM63, usually built with new production parts. And because it's still during the assault weapons ban, we can't have a lot of fun features. But that would change. To some, it was quite the surprise when the assault weapons ban was allowed to sunset in the fall of 2004. But Century was ready and attacked the market with all kinds of variants with a vengeance. AES-10B, full throttle. Helps if I charge it.
Mm-hmm. You're good.
But before that, going back to 2003, importation of the SAR-1 would cease. For pretty obvious reasons, because of the double stack magwell arrangement. In that year, we would get the first WASR-10s here. What does WASR-10 stand for? Well, 10's pretty easy. WASR, though, I've heard a lot of people say things, both serious and joking. I don't know that anyone knows. I can say that in Europe, Romania has a very similar version that they sell as the WSR-1, 2, and so on and so forth over there. So it's just one of their names. But since these were still being sold during the ban period, they did not have threaded barrels, and they did not have bayonet lugs. They were often sold with pistol grips, although sometimes they still had the Dragonov stock. And they would open up the magwells, at least on some of them. Century would sell them both single and double stack. And they would have fixed buttstocks. Let's talk about furniture. By the way, these handguards are actually off an SAR-1. In the Romanian military, the PM-1963 was really the first production model made by Cugir. Before that, they were using milled AKs sourced from Russia, although some say they might have assembled them in Romania. But no, the PM-63 was a variant of the AKM Type 4 made there. And the first ones were very, very similar to standard AKM. They would have palm swell handguards. The first couple of years they would even have wood pistol grips, but then they would very quickly go to this inverted checkered Bakelite style. and they would have hardwood buttstocks. They would even have a pretty attractive salt blue, or at least matte blue, maybe oxide, finish. Later on, phosphating would creep in. So what about the dong? Well, it didn't actually start off with the PM63. The dong would appear a few years later. Some sources say 1966, some say 67, some say 68, and it was kind of a gradual thing. But by the 70s, this was standard for Romanian military. However, for export, and this was exported under the name AIM, A-I-M, not to be confused with the 90s messenger, they would continue to do the palm swell handguard. It's also reported that some, like the Romanian Navy and Marines, preferred the palm swell to the dong because they were worried the dong might get caught on things on board a ship. So both handguards were made. Also, this is laminate. They've used both hardwood and laminate interchangeably since the laminate was introduced in the late 60s. So there's no real clear-cut cutoff for laminate versus hardwood because they continue to make both in different cycles. The same thing goes with the finish. They seem to at least have three finishes, kind of a black oxide on some guns, kind of a matte blue, and more of a rough phosphate. And I think they just use them interchangeably. And of course the gear would change as well. But when the assault weapons ban sunset, that's when they were able to add bayonet lugs. Now, all WASR-10s come in single stack magwell, thumbhole stock, and with a ground down bayonet lug, just like on this SAR-1 here. What Century does is they weld one back up. That's why some of these lugs are kind of higgledy-piggledy. But for the threads, they were a little more clever. They actually just spot weld a muzzle nut on for import, and then once over here, Century breaks the tack weld and attaches usually a sugar scoop like this. At least for some models. They've sold them all kinds of different configurations. But at this time, they're still built from current production parts. By that I mean 2004 dated trunnion or 2005 dated trunnion. However, in 2005, an interesting event happened in Washington, D.C., an interesting change to how parts kits were handled, and that would have a major effect on WASRs. WASR KR. In the early 21st century, a decade after the Cold War was over, the Romanian military downsized, meaning they had quite a bit of equipment. They had plenty of AKs. They didn't have a lot of hard cash from the West, so they started cutting up the receivers of PM63s, PM65s, and even some later PM90s, and sending them over here. At that time, they could bring them over with intact barrels. This worked great. Basically, get a US receiver, do some riveting, pop your front end. If the serial numbers match between bolt and trunnion, there was a 9 out of 10 chance that headspace was good to go. So it was very easy to build. But in 2005, the ATF, Customs, the executive branch, decided that parts kits could no longer be imported with barrels if those barrels had been touched by the evil machine gun receiver, meaning that those cheap Romanian parts kits could still come in, but with either no barrel or a cut-up barrel. And they did. They continued to import Romanian kits, but Century and Cugir got smart. Now, when they went from the WASR-10 and added the bayonet lug and threaded barrel, they called this the GP WASR-10 for general purpose. And our next step would appear in 2007, known as the GP WASR-10 63. And at the time, these were only moderately noticed, but in more recent years, they actually have received a lot of attention And I still get a lot of questions about the 1063 to this day. And these are two variants of it. So again, let's revisit them.
WASR KR.
Essentially, these are Romanian builds. Instead of sending the demilled rifle to the USA for rebuilding, Cugir would rebuild it. They would use a new semi-automatic WASR receiver. They would also install a new unused Virgin 16-inch, well in this case 12.5-inch, chrome-lined cold hammer forged barrel. But otherwise they would use original military parts. And that would give us some pretty interesting dates and trunnion markings over the years. And if you were lucky, your parts would match. Usually with these, major parts would match, but some smaller ones like gas tube or rear sight may not. But the flip side to that, you could get some really interesting variations in different eras of parts. Obviously, production in Romania didn't stay the same. Over time, they would make changes. Like I said earlier, they already changed the furniture. And they would change several parts starting in the 70s. For example, the underfolding stock would have a style change. And around 75, 76, they would actually start introducing some parts made from castings, much as Russia had done. And by 1980, 82, many parts were made from castings, meaning there's all kinds of little manufacturing tweaks. Also, with the 1063s, you'll get a mix of phosphated and sometimes blued parts. They were a bit of a crap show, frankly, but in a good way, if that makes sense. You never knew exactly what you were going to get. We're going to revisit this guy in a minute, but since it is a 1063 variant, I thought I'd go ahead and bring it out. Here's also a really cool magazine that Arms of America imported a couple years back with a lanyard loop on it, very much Romanian. Now in 1965, Cugir and the Romanian military introduced the PM65, an underfolder. And at the beginning it would have palm swell handguards, but then they would also introduce a special reverse dong foregrip. Now the barrel is quite the same, standard bayonet lug, standard 14x1 threads. But the difference was in the back. This is not a standard AK-MS buttstock. Rather, as I pointed out in other videos, it's actually the buttstock from the original AKs, the Type 3. It's only locking on this side here, not the other. It has the butt plate with spring-loaded detents. And this is an earlier one, so it is actually a machined buttstock. Beginning in the late 60s, early 70s, they would introduce a couple of new versions. Initially, they would still have a machined buttstock, but they would greatly simplify it. This is actually the stock that appears on the current WASR-10 UF imports. But later than that, when stampings appeared in the late 70s, they would go to a stamped tubular buttstock. And you can tell it because it's kind of got a mashed area on the right side here to clear the safety adequately. And so there are at least 3 major variants of this underfolding stock, and maybe a couple of minor variants besides. Makes it a bit unique that they went with this style of stock. And these were used by mountain troops, the Romanian Marines, Special Forces. It's heavy because of the stock, but it can also be made quite a bit more compact, and it's just kind of useful to have around. And this was the first time with the WASR 1063 UF we really got a different stock option here. Before, Century Map put different furniture sets on, but like a stock like this fits in a standard rear trunnion. This was a wholly different gun. Unfortunately, when these came in, we all thought they were way too expensive. And the quality was kind of hit or miss, I'm not going to lie. Because in 2008, President Obama was elected, so there was a bit of a buying panic for the rest of that year and well into 2009, meaning Century and Cugir both cranked up production really to levels they probably should not have. So this is where you get things like sloppily cut out mag wells, poorly installed trigger groups, and more mismatched or just poorly fitted parts. But still yet, the majority of guns were fine. And kind of to make up for that, this is when they started coming with a lot of cool swag too.
WASR-10. No wire folders.
The WUM-1, the Romak-1, the Romak-991, even the SAR-1 and the early WASR-10s, at least some of them, really just came with a cleaning kit, usually a modern green sling, and 1 to 2 mags. But with the GP WASR-10, and especially the 1063, they would start coming with at least 2 30-round mags, sometimes more if it was a promo. You would get a wide range of surplus slings, again, because there's so much surplus Romanian gear available, including a lot of different styles of leather sling. And you would get mag pouches. This one's from a WASR-10. A common one was this 2-cell. There's also a 3-cell, and even a canvas 4-cell. And you never knew what you were going to get till you get, open the box and see, you got a mag pouch. But what it was, who knows. You still got an oiler, still got a cleaning kit, and you got a Romanian bayonet with frog. Heck, sometimes for a little bit, you even got a Romanian bayonet and a SETME Model C bayonet, which confused the hell out of a lot of people. But yeah, this is when they were throwing a lot of swag in the box, and the guns were quite cheap. For the converted one with the cut open mag well, working bayonet lug, threaded barrel, dealer cost was between $3 and $3.25, sometimes even less on sale. And the reason Romania was able to do this, aside from the exchange rate benefiting America at the time, keep in mind, what cost did they really have in these guns? Yeah, they had to make a new U.S.-made stampers or U.S.-compliant stamped receiver. They did have to make a new, or at least use up an existing unused barrel. But everything else, front sight, gas block, gas system, hand guards, trunnion, sights, top cover, bolt group, it was all taken from either existing stocks that Cugir inherited from the communist era or taken from decommissioned military service rifles. So yeah, their cost, their expense, their time in them was so low, which kind of made 2008 through 2013 the golden age for the Romanian imports. And this is all in the WASR series. Well, nearly so. AES-10B. I nearly talked myself out of bringing this out again since it has been featured in a video recently, but I couldn't help myself, and I wanted to talk about how it kind of fits into the wider series of Romanian guns. These appeared first as the AES-10 that we showed you, and then around 2006 is the AES-10B. And at this time they were built from all new parts and they had a fixed clubfoot stock. And bipods were all over the place, but the first ones typically had a PKM style bipod. Later, the AES-10B would come in kind of regular but limited runs. And sometimes they would appear built from decommissioned rifles, and other times they would be built from new production parts. You could tell based on the date on the trunnion. It just depended. So you would see one of 3 different bipod variants, really 4 if you count the PKM. But we were still doing the fixed stock at that time. Now this is based on the PM-64 light machine gun, which is Romania's licensed-produced version of the Russian Molot RPK. And for a time, they made an exact copy. But as the 70s and 80s wore on, they would start doing their own thing, like the new style of bipod. Now, this was a special run, and as far as I know, they're all dated 1989, of so-called paratrooper models of the PM-64. They have the push-button wire folding stock. They have a carry handle, although that may not have been original to the design, and they had the late-style bipod. Originally, the military guns also had this foregrip, although as imported, the AAS-10B paratrooper, this was removed. We'll talk about why in just a minute. And they were pretty consistent because they were all from the same batch. And it's said that this might have been the last batch of 7.62x39 PM-64s made for the Romanian military, because this is right around the time they went to the 5.45x39 RPK 74-ish gun. Who knows? But I do remember the original AAS-10Bs were quite affordable. On sale, they were hardly any more expensive than the WASR-10. Even not on sale, they weren't all that much higher. But these paratroopers, from the get-go, at a time when you could get the fixed stock for $500 or $600, the paratrooper dealer cost was $900. So I actually waited quite a while to pick one up. But that said, it's a very cool and unique model for both Romania and in our semi-auto series. And of course, a lot of times they would ship them with the drum, or you could buy it extra for $100. And a lot of times they would come with a 4-cell mag pouch, and you get 2 or 4 Romanian 40-round mags. And you could either get a leather or a modern green sling. Now from Century, they shipped with the sugar scoop brake, but in mine here, I put the Romanian bird cage on, just because I like it. And with the mention of the birdcage and the modern sling, let's kind of jump forward to the next military series and the next import run. Then we'll wrap things up.
AAS-10B. Wolverines. I wanted to mention, forgot another part, this comes with a carry handle. A lot of the kits won't, because this was more of a feature of the PM-93, but you see it on some of these too, so just wanted to talk about the carry handle for a sec.
As the communist government in Romania was less friendly with that in Russia, Cugir started kind of developing some of its own patterns. In the early 80s, it introduced the first side-folding variant, the PM-80, which is a really weird stock. I've had those stocks before. I don't have one now to show you. They were typically paired with about a 12.5-inch barrel. It was essentially a underfolder stock cut in half with a folding butt plate still, and it folded to the left side and required a flush trunnion. It was a weird thing and a very pretty, not great stock. But then they had more success with this style of stock. The PA-86 introduced a simplified and slightly customized version of the East German side folder, same as used by Poland. And with that, Cugir would update it and put it on the 7.62x39 guns. Now there's the lever style, like these two have. This is primarily known for export. There's also the button style, which is primarily what the military would be using in Romania. So 2 patterns there. So we basically get the PM-90. That's how I have this WASR set up, because why not? And now people say it's basically a PA-86, but in 7.62x39, not really. I don't believe these had the 3-way selector. Correct me if I'm wrong. It seems like they basically just took the newer side folding stock, either push button or lever, put it on the PM-63, and then made the sugar scoop brake standard. before the 70s, the muzzle nut was standard. Throughout the 80s, it was kind of a mix between muzzle nut and sugar scoop. And with the so-called PM90, this was standard. They would also either do palm swell handguards, especially when it was exported as the AIMS, AIMS, or sometimes they would do the vertical dong. Now, but the PM90 name was not so much Romanian military as it was a Cugir. And I think it was kind of trying to put a fresh coat of paint on an aging car, because you could just as easily take a PM63, add the furniture and muzzle device, and make it into this. So it wasn't a huge step forward, but it was them trying to make the design a little different, and they had quite good export success. The standard PM90 had the 16.25-inch barrel. The PM90 short rifle would usually have the same side folding stock, and it had a short barrel and combination front sight gas block. It also had a shorter range rear sight, usually 400, sometimes 500 meters. One thing that's kind of interesting, this system is a little bit different. The gas piston, the gas block, even the barrel length fluctuate a little bit between 11.9 and 12.6. So there are actually at least two major variants in the gas piston length here, and also the length of the gas block, how far it goes back. Either way, this is a shorty, so-called carbine, and of course the barrel would end here. And while they could have muzzle nuts, a lot of times they did have that birdcage flash hider on them that you just saw on my RPK there. Interesting thing about the PM90 carbines, though, they did not usually have the vertical foregrip. The palm swell was standard. And then you have this style here, which is a slab side, which is also an option. And for export, the PM90 carbines were known as the AIMR, A-I-M-R. So this was kind of the 90s generation of the Romanian guns that were alongside the PA-86, and that translated into the WASR series. Again, this is the short-lived WASR-10 63KR, but you can still get the Draco pistol. The pistol has about a 12.5-inch barrel. The mini Draco has about a 7.8-inch barrel. And the micro Draco has a ridiculously short 5.9-inch barrel. Did I mention it's ridiculous? The mini and the micro are not military. The full-size 12-some-odd-inch barrel has been used by Romanian Special Forces and whatnot. There are still some PM63s in reserve service, especially the Garda guns are still around, the G-Marked. And the PM65, the Underfolder, is around at very limited numbers, typically with the Navy and the Marines, but pretty limited stuff. Mostly today, Romania uses the PA-86 and 545, or some foreign guns they purchased in 556. But the good WASR times, the 1063s, the low prices, all the variants and styles, this would start to end around 2013, and that kind of gets us into the modern era of the WASR-10 and what variants exist today. M10. By the way, this nice soft green sling was introduced with the PA-86, and so that's why it was the standard sling, new production sling shipped in the 90s and 2000s. I really like it. I have the 40-round mag in here just for fun. This is a Hungarian 20-rounder, but Romania did make 20-rounders that were similar to this, but they had a flat space on the bottom here. But yeah, they would kind of rework the design. Century went through a lot of changes, and therefore what they ordered from Romania would change in 2013, 2014. They would discontinue the WASR-2 in 545 and the WASR-3 in 5.56. The AAS-10B and the PSL would disappear for a time. The Underfolder would disappear for a time. Those would return, thankfully. But the options never quite reached those levels again. And more importantly, the pricing certainly went up. Now, it's also worth pointing out that the fit and finish from Romania seems to have improved, and Century has taken more care with debanding the mag well and whatnot. An odd thing, though, is the bayonet lugs are more intermittent now. They were pretty standard on non-band state WASRs for a long time, but yeah, for whatever reason, nowadays, Century's kind of eh. Now, one other importer of the Romanian guns would be M+M, basically Colorado Gun Sale's sister company. They would bring over the M10. This would lead to some problems, though. But basically, the M10 was a combination front sight gas block like this, but it had a full-length gas system and it had a full-length 16-inch barrel, and it could be had in several calibers and configurations. Well, Century did pick up the M10 concept and made it into the Paratrooper model, which has a slightly thinner barrel, and the RH10, which looks essentially just like the M10, except usually has different furniture, but it's mostly just, yeah, Century. So your M10, RH10, they have a combination front sight gas block, but instead of having the Draco length 12 some odd inch barrel, they have the 16 1/4 inch barrel, and the profiles can change a little bit too. And some of the M10 do-it-yourself actions have been sold by Centerfire and Atlantic Firearms in recent years, but by the most part, Century is kind of the name of the game here. And of course, there's the WASR-10 V2, but we're going to leave that for another video. One more thing, one odd thing I do want to show you. M10.
Helps if I don't have the safety on, huh?
Sometimes, with some guns, not so much.
Clear.
So early on, like the export military guns, we had Palmswell handguards, either hardwood or laminate. But then with the 1063s, we're building from parts kits. And if they're military service from Romania, they would have had the front foregrip, right? Well, where did it go? Did they add different handguards? No. What they did with many of the WASR 1063s, even some of the WASR 10s, they took a handguard that once had a dong, and they actually just cut it off. And if you have one that's been done that way, you can actually feel the leftover kind of bulgy area here at the bottom where it once was. I said I would share that, because for a time, these were considered not desirable. Also, they weren't really kosher for importation, so they would have had to have swapped handguards around. Century did sell a few limited models with dongs, but people, they didn't like the forward grip for a number of years. It's only, again, in recent times that it's kind of become popular. Now, this is a different handguard. This is not one that ever had a dong on it. This is out of one of those virgin kits that M+M imported a few years ago. And you can tell it never had a dong cut in it, at least after finishing, because of the very flat underside. It might have been from the original kind of mold, as you'd think, but the finishing is very even as from the factory. Whereas the Century ones, yeah, it was pretty crudely done. The early ones would have a nice lacquered finish, then they would kind of go to that oil finish laminate, and then your later WASRs would have that very dry, kind of dull wood look. But the good news is, the wood was actually high quality, even though people often mocked it. It just needed some TLC, and you could really bring it back to life and do some fun things with it. And that's kind of where we're at. I'm trying to think if there's any other questions people asked. You know, the basics, yeah, your early guns, WUM-1s, Romak-1s, they were double stackers. Your Romak-991s were essentially proto-WASR-10s. And the difference between WASR-10 and GP WASR-10 is bayonet lug or not, and threaded barrel or not. And then finally, the difference between 1063 and a regular 10, at least generally speaking, it wasn't always true, but the 1063 was assembled using original military trunnions and other parts, whereas a WASR-10 was usually built from current new production parts. There were a ton of myths about these, but the things about rejected parts and substandard parts were never proven, and yeah, they didn't really exist. So with that, let's wrap things up. AES-10B, last mag of the day. And there we have it. A little bit of new info, but hopefully we're organizing some of the old info into one guide to help people out, because Romanian AKs are just about the most common ones in the USA and have been since the demise of the Chinese. So I understand completely why there's so much interest in them. And they are interesting guns. I honestly like their rough and ready look. The AES-10B still stands out as the only authentic original pattern RPK semi we've ever had. The SAR-1 is great because it has a mil-spec magwell. It was built from new parts, and aside from not having the bayonet lug or threaded barrel, it's as close as you're going to get to an AKM. There's a debate between it and the Mod-I. In some ways, the Mod-I is more authentic, but in other ways, I still like the Romanian more. The underfolder was special. This was one of the first factory-built underfolders to be imported since the sunset of the assault weapons ban, and it has the somewhat unique stock configuration, as we already talked about. And then, of course, you can make any WASR into a PM90 because the differences are minor, to say the least. And while the WASR KR is not a common gun, thankfully the Draco pistol, or mini Draco, or micro Draco, are still quite gettable. And they're a neat little fun carbine to pick up. I don't know, guys, they're just a lot of fun, and I'm happy that they kind of get the appreciation they so rightly deserve. So I hope I've answered most of your questions, but if you have any, please post them in the comments. More importantly, if I got something wrong, please let me know in the comments, and I'll be happy to make corrections, because there's not one big definitive for sure source on Romanian guns. What we know about these is kind of pieced together by observation, a little bit of hearsay, and some comments from Romanian citizens here and there. Yeah, we don't really know a lot about these, which is kind of fun in its own right. So yeah, feel free to share anything you might like below. It is greatly appreciated. And as always, if you could just share the video, like, share, subscribe, that other stuff, that helps a lot too. And if you'd like to help support the channel, you know the deal. Please check out the link to the Patreon. And as I said at the beginning, this is kind of the end of this video cycle. I'm going to be taking a little vacation in August. It's just so hot, and I've got a lot of other things to take care of. But before that, check back in 1 to 2 days, because we've got a very, very special video to be published that I have been working on, and many others have been working on for quite a while now. So we really hope you enjoy it. Excited to kind of get people's feedbacks on that. But I wanted to address the Romanian AK questions since some of you had them. So hope that I helped there. And with that, this is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.